Hi, I'm Kate Mesh, and I'm a researcher in the Lund University Humanities Lab. And I'm here today to talk about something that you and I do all the time when we're communicating with people about things in the space surrounding us. Specifically, how you and I point things out for each other. I'm going to be talking about work that I did in collaboration with people here in Lund, and also with a research team in Mexico. So be warned, there's going to be a lot of talk about we and us, even though I'm the only person standing up here today. To start out, I want to be clear about what I mean when I say pointing things out for each other. Pointing is an activity that we do to draw people's attention to spaces and invite them to look for what we're talking about inside those spaces. So if I say something like, "Look that way," I'm inviting you to look in a specific direction. And if I say, "Hey, look at that thing," I'm inviting you to give your attention to a very specific object. I've just given two examples that involved pointing with my hands and arms, and I could have given an example of pointing with my chin, and all of these would have been good ways to show pointing as a gesture. And for this talk, I'm going to be describing all of those activities as pointing gestures. But I also used examples with words like this and that, or I could have used words like here and there, and these also point. These are examples of what linguists call demonstratives, but we'll call pointing words. I can use pointing words by themselves. So I could keep my hands down at my sides and say, "Here we are," and you'll have some good idea of what I mean by here. I can also use pointing gestures by themselves, so it's perfectly fine for me to say, and anticipate that you know without words that I want you to look that way. But more often than not, I'll probably pair a pointing word and a pointing gesture. That's just what people do. Now, I've just made this broad claim about people, and it's going to bring up a question. It's a very reasonable one. Do I mean all people, and do we all point in exactly the same way? And I think you already might have a clue about the answer here, because I'm speaking English, but I'm speaking to an international audience. So I used words like here and there, but you're also very likely to have other pointing words in your vocabularies that are slightly different. And in fact, across languages, we find that people use these pointing words in slightly different ways. So no, we don't all use pointing words in the same way. But you might be a bit surprised to find out that actually we don't all use pointing gestures in the same way too. So to illustrate this, I'm going to give you an example from a group of people I've worked with for the past 10 years in Oaxaca, Mexico, the Chatino people. The Chatinos are an indigenous group, which means they're some of the first peoples of Mexico, and they use a set of languages that are also called Chatino. They have many, many pointing words, but for today's talk, what I really want to focus on is how they point using gesture. They have a strategy that I like to call far is up. So the farther away the item is that you want to talk about, the higher you will aim your pointing gesture. Let me show you two examples so you can really see what I mean when I say they have a far is up strategy. The woman here is going to point to something that's very, very close to her. So let me just show you quickly what that looks like. And let's look at it one more time. So you can see this seems like a pretty standard pointing gesture. Now she's going to talk about something that's about 8 kilometers away, and I want you to really pay attention to how she changes. She's answering a question, so she's saying there, and I want you to see how she changes the point to answer that question. Okay, let me show you that one more time. Everything you need to know to understand the study that we ran this past year, we've just gone over. First, that pointing is different across cultures, and second, that Chatino people in particular have a far is up strategy, where they point higher for things that are farther. What we wanted to understand was, how do people pair pointing words with these really specialized pointing gestures in Chatino communities? So to answer the question, we took people on a series of hikes, and we asked them, what's important about the spaces along this hiking trail? And what are important towns nearby? And when people listed these things, we said, can you tell us where those things are? When they gave answers to those questions, we video recorded them. And then we looked inside the video for two things: the specialized pointing gestures that I just described for you, and the pointing words that they paired with those gestures. We learned two really interesting things from the patterns that people used for pointing in this study. The first thing is that when you're pointing to an item far or relatively near you, and I should say by you I mean a participant in this study in Mexico, you'll be more likely to use just a word. So you're not going to point with your finger, you're just going to say here or there. But if the item gets farther away, you're much more likely to point with your hand and with a word. So already we can see that by using both of these pointing strategies together, pointing words and pointing gestures, people are giving you an idea of the fact that the item they're talking about is a little bit farther away. The second thing we found is that the way people in our particular study put pointing words and pointing gestures together, it became clear that they were actually using them to redirect attention twice. First, to the gesturing hand. So the word would draw attention to the body and the hand. Then the hand itself would redirect attention out towards the object that they were trying to point to. This is especially effective for Chatino speakers because their pointing gestures are packed with information about distance, so they're really effective for redirecting attention out into space. Now that we've run this study, we understand a few new things about how pointing words and pointing gestures are combined, at least for one group of people. But we still have some questions about bits of pointing that we don't fully understand. Is it possible, for example, that some of what Chatino people did here is also done here in Europe? I think the answer is probably yes. I think that if you go home and you talk to people about items that are near and then a little bit farther, and they start to point them out and compare them for you, you'll see that when they talk about things that are farther, they'll point a little bit higher. So you'll get a little flavor of this up is far. But it's going to look quite different from what you saw in the videos today. So this gets at questions of, if we share some of the same basic strategies, how do they end up looking so different across cultures? And we're actually running a study in Europe right now to try to answer that question. How do people here point, and how similar or different is it from the strategies that we're seeing in what certainly looks very different in Mexico? Now, what I want you to take home from this talk is two things. First, that pointing is not the same across every culture, because that may have been a surprising piece of information. And second, that something as easy as pointing can actually be really complex. It feels pretty simple for you and me. We don't have a hard time pointing with words and pointing with gestures. And that really speaks to how sophisticated human communication actually is. Before I end this talk, I want to make sure you know why it's possible. I received funding for this research from the European Research Commission, and I have also received funding and support from Lund University and from CSS, the Center for the Study of Social Anthropology in Mexico City. I think it must be obvious to you that there's no way that we could research about Chatino languages unless we worked with Chatino people who are enthusiastic about using their languages and about documenting them. So I want to give a special thanks to the research team in the Chatino community where we worked, which is called San Juan Quiaige. I'd also like to thank you for coming here and showing curiosity about how pointing works, and hopefully for getting more engaged with the questions of how sophisticated face-to-face human interaction really can be.